This is Triangulation, our best of 2018. I know you've been waiting for this all year. Some of the best conversations, the best moments from episodes gone by. I hope you're having a great holiday season. And now for your enjoyment, the best of Triangulation 2018.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
This is Triangulation, episode 378 for Friday, December 28th, 2018. The year's best. Well, ho, 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 everybody. I can't believe it. We're wrapping up 2018, getting ready for a brand new year. Triangulation is our show where we get to interview the most interesting, the smartest people in technology. 2018 saw a big change in Triangulation. This year, I decided to share the spotlight with my co-hosts. Of course, Megan Morrone from iOS Today and Tech News Weekly. Also from Tech News Weekly and All About Android, Jason Howell. And we've lost him now to the Vatican. But Father Robert Ballecer also did his share of Triangulations. We've got some great moments from all three for this year. Starting off with a great interview that Megan did with one of the pioneers of Wikipedia, Larry Sanger.
So let's start at the beginning. Wikipedia, you were one of the co-founders. Tell us a little bit about what inspired you. I know Newpedia came a little bit before that, and you were the editor-in-chief of Newpedia. Talk a little bit about the beginnings of Wikipedia.
Sure. Well, basically, I was wrapping up a website that I had been working on about the Millennium Bug, the Y2K problem. And I was going to repurpose that. And I sent out a little proposal to different acquaintances and friends of mine, one of whom was Jimmy Wales. And he replied, totally out of the blue, saying, "Don't work on that. Why don't you come and work on this new website that I want to start?" We're calling it Newpedia, N-U-pedia, and it will basically use open source principles, applying it to content development instead of software development. And we will create the world's first free encyclopedia. And I thought that sounded awesome. And, not being married at the time, I could just pick up and go across the country. And I did that same, within a couple of weeks. I was driving out to San Diego. And our first version of the site, Newpedia, was very slow. We only produced a few dozen articles in a time. And the reason for that is that we were essentially trying to secure high quality for articles. This is something that Jimmy Wales and I agreed on from the beginning. We wanted really to make this a credible encyclopedia, and to secure the high quality, we were going to have this long process, and we thought that people would just go through it. But they didn't want to go through an 8-step process or a 7-step process. So by the summer, we had already were well agreed that, due to our testing of the concept by email, we needed to come up with an easier way for people to submit new articles, at the very least. And so I proposed a lot of different things, and even very lightweight mechanisms. But Jimmy Wales, the CEO of the company that started this, called Bombus.com, he rejected the ideas because that would entail hiring more programmers, which he just didn't want to do, didn't think it should be necessary. Probably mostly because Newpedia was not making any money, and it wasn't likely to make money for a while. So after, again, several months of casting around, I had dinner with a friend of mine, Ben Kovitz, who told me about wikis and how he had been wasting a bunch of time on it, talking to people and like co-editing pages, and the whole idea sounded crazy as it did at the time, and still does to some people. The notion that anyone could edit a page, and so they could couldn't they just erase all the content? Yes, but then it's very easy for people to restore the content and so forth, and it works. So I immediately thought we could use this tool for the problem that we're trying to solve with Nupedia, and so that became basically Wikipedia. The reason it wasn't just Nupedia is that the Nupedia Advisory Board, which was just all of the PhD editors who were overseeing Nupedia, they just didn't want to have anything to do with something that would allow hoi polloi to just get on board and start mucking things up. And, the whole idea sounded absolutely absurd to them. And Jimmy Wales initially also, although he was perfectly willing to install the software, he was quite skeptical at first as well. But so we decided we still want to try this, and so we'll just create a new website for a new data stream. It wouldn't be branded as part of Nupedia. So I came up with the name Wikipedia, and we launched it on July 15th, just a couple of weeks after we had the idea. And
so that was the year 2000 or 2001?
Year 2001. So it's like almost 1 year after I had started working on Nupedia. So, and it was, we had a ready-made, highly motivated community. A lot of people who wanted to work on an encyclopedia, and the whole idea of building one on a wiki was really kind of cool. People really liked the idea, and at least a lot of the people who were involved in Nupedia. And so we got a lot of early adopters, a few dozen right away, I guess. And that was enough to actually start creating content. And what happened was, basically, we were the first encyclopedia articles online for a lot of topics in the early months. And so a virtuous cycle developed between Wikipedia and Google, so that we would write a bunch of articles on these new topics that Google didn't have any encyclopedia pages about. And then people who were looking for those topics would click on, they'd just jump to the top, or near the top anyway, of the Google search, and then we knew when the Google bot had hit the site. It wasn't going all the time back then. It was once a month, and after the results of the Google bot hitting us hit Google, we got a spike in traffic, and then and so more people got involved that way. And they wrote more articles. And so it's just month after month, it would just go up and up and up like that until we had 20,000 articles after the first year, which sounds like not very much now, obviously, but it seemed like a whole lot back then, especially for something like this hadn't really been done before.
We're talking with Mike Elgin. And so in a way, this is a blueprint, right? For if somebody, and I think this is a lot of people's dream.
Yeah.
But a lot of people like me say, but I could never do it.
Yes.
So this would help us, right?
This will help anyone who wants to travel more, even if you want to travel a little bit more, because this isn't just a sort of manifesto for how to become nomadic full or most of the time. It's a complete alternative to tourism. It's to me, it's the opposite of tourism. Okay, and what I mean by that is, what is a tourist? A tourist is a category of consumer. If you're a tourist, you're a consumer of travel services and products.
I'm a tourist.
Yeah, everybody's a tourist.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the thing. And as you've noticed when you've gone abroad, there are lots of tourists out there.
Yeah.
And
it's kind of fundamentally dissatisfying too.
Yeah, you're trying to get at the place, but it's just all these other people who are visitors sort of get in the way. So
it becomes Disneyland instead of another country.
Exactly. Yeah. One of the perfect examples, I mean, I know you were in France recently. I think I saw you driving by on the highway.
Each other on the highway.
And you know, you go to France, and there's this charming old school looking sort of bar, and it's like, oh, Hemingway used to come here.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, why do people care about Hemingway? Well, they read A Movable Feast,
right,
which is a great book. And what was that about? It wasn't, Hemingway wasn't being a tourist.
He was living in Paris.
He lived in Paris.
Yeah.
It was about he knew people. His friends were there. He shopped there. He bought firewood in the street. He would go to these bars and just hang out for hours.
That's what we want. Yeah.
That's what we want.
It's the year in Provence. There are a million books like this, and we want that.
We want that. And so we can have that. And the way we can have that is, it's all in the book, but one of the greatest things that ever happened for people who want to actually live in a place rather than be a tourist is sites like Airbnb. We can actually just roll right into somebody's apartment.
It's easier than it used to be.
Well, the thing is that when when Airbnb first opened up in Cuba, for example, within the first few months of it being open, we went to Cuba, and you go and the person next to you on this side, and the person next to you on that side, and the person across the hall, and the people in your building, nobody is a tourist. Nobody's a visitor. They're all Cubans. And then you go shopping at the store where they shop, and then every day you go by and you see the same dog, and you get to know people, and you meet friends, and you become Cuban. You become French. You become a temporary local in these various places. And food, Leo, is the key. It opens all the doors.
Because we all have to eat.
Well, not only do we all have to eat, we all, food is kind of an expression of culture.
Yes.
So you go and find foodies in any place, and they will suddenly light up, and they want to share it with you.
We had you on Twitter. You were calling from a roof I think it was in Fez, and it was during Ramadan.
Yeah.
And we talked about how everybody had fasted throughout the day, and then when the sun went down, it was a massive party, and we could hear it from the roof.
Yes.
And as a tourist, you'd be in a hotel somewhere, or you'd be back on the boat, and you'd be gone.
That's right.
You had the experience of what it's like to break fast in Ramadan.
Right. And we were living in this 400-year-old Riyadh, just absolute beautiful place. Before we got there was some overlap in the schedule, so we were like 3 or 4 days living. We didn't have the whole place to ourselves. We were living with a family. And the man who was the person we interacted with mainly, he said, when you're in my house, you are my family.
Yeah.
We're going to have Ramadan. We're going to break, it's called iftar when they break the fast.
Iftar, right.
And we crowded around this tiny table with, must have had like 6 or 7 kids of every size and shape, and incredible Ramadan food, and we would sit there for a couple of hours.
And that breaks the ice. That's not like you going to a mosque and walking around. You're there at their table sharing that meal. That is
in people's
intimate
homes
experience.
At their dining room table. That's where it is. That's where the stories are. That's where the reality is. That's the culture. That's the place. Yeah. It's not the services that people are selling you. It's that's the place.
We know that in our own lives, though. Yes. That's in our own lives. Those are the times that we most remember, that we, even with just family and friends, that we, those are the times that you remember. Those are the intimate experiences. Yeah,
that's exactly right.
We're talking about with Mike Elgin, old friend, good friend, dear friend, and his wife Amira, who travel the world, and he still no one knows.
No one knows.
He still writes his column for Computer World and Fast Company, and he's written a new book. This is it. It's called Gastro Nomad: The Art of Living Everywhere and Eating Everything. And he's got the world on the cover in an ice cream cone, which really does look delicious. By the way, so I have the print edition, which is handy for putting in your backpack as you go around the world, and has great pictures. But if you go to, if you buy for $10, the Amazon Kindle version, you get all of these great pictures in color as well. That is a stunning picture. I'm going to ask you about that in a second. Don't tell me. I'm going to ask you about that in a second, but we'll have more with Mike and learn more about the book. And then let me recommend you go to Amazon, you pick up a copy. Is that the best place? Should they go to your gastronomad.net or
Amazon? Search for Gastro Nomad, or you can go to gastronomad.net. Either one.
$15 for the paperback, $10 for the Kindle edition, and now I have both. We're talking to Annalee Newitz, her new book is Autonomous, and I want to point out right away that this is not that book. This is not, oh my God, the horrible future. It's not. I wouldn't even say it's dystopian at all. It's not utopian, but you wouldn't say it's dystopian either, right?
It's topian.
It's topian.
Yeah, it's the future where
it's the future. It's a mixed bag.
It's a mix. It's very much a mixed bag, and I think, and I tried really hard to make a future that felt like, some things really have improved and some things have gotten worse. And that's sort of how it is. You solve one problem and then you get new problems. And so that's kind of what the characters are struggling with is, they have fantastic biotech. There's a really great sustainable fuel economy. People are living in a sustainable way. Climate change is still happening, but people are actively working to make sure that it slows down.
Yeah, well, most of the action takes place in the Canadian far north.
That's right.
It doesn't take long to realize, oh, they're living there because it's a comfortable climate now.
It's more comfortable, yeah.
Yeah.
And the Arctic is ice free, and one of the characters is a pirate with a submarine that she kind of keeps in the Arctic. You got to have a pirate ship.
Yes. She's you, though, isn't she? You don't have a scar going down like that.
I really don't think any of those characters
She's you.
are
Come on, Annalee. Jack is you. I know she is. I love Jack. She's very...
I love Jack, too. She makes some bad mistakes.
She made some bad choices, but she did them from the right place.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the fun of writing these characters is trying to come up with someone who is believable in the sense that, she's doing some heroic stuff. She's pirating expensive medicines to give them at a reduced price or for free to the poor, because this is sort of a pharmaceutical corporation future where pharmaceutical companies are very powerful. And that's a great thing and that's very heroic, but she also makes a lot of mistakes. And that's what I like in a character is someone who feels like they're not just perfect, they're not like Superman. Even though I know Superman makes some mistakes once in a while too now, but I wanted her to feel real.
Well, very much so. And I love the ambiguity of that. And I think that's one of the reasons that this is getting really hailed as a first novel showing real mastery of the form. And that's pretty exciting, I think.
Yeah.
All right. So we're speaking with Melissa Schilling, author of Quirky, a fantastic read, by the way. You can get it on Audible if you want to listen to it. I did that as well as read through the book. It fit into my schedule perfectly, and the read, by the way, on Audible is fantastic. So really enjoyed the audiobook. Third characteristic, we haven't really talked. I mean, we've touched on the creative mind a little bit, but let's dive into this a little bit. What is the difference? What is the line between intelligence and creativity? It's probably a very blurry line now that I think about it, but talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, that chapter also talks a lot about, it actually explains a lot of why we associate madness and genius together, which is pretty fascinating. So I'll start with the intelligence part. And I want to back up for a second. A lot of what's in this chapter was really revealed by studying Nikola Tesla very intensely, because Nikola Tesla had traits that it turned out all the other innovators also had, but he had them to such an extreme that you couldn't miss them. So there are things you notice in Tesla that you didn't notice in the others until you went to look for it. If you study no one at all, if you had to pick one innovator in this group to study, you'll probably pick Elon because he's so hot right now. But you should study Nikola Tesla because he is the most extreme of the innovators, and in some ways a little bit broken. Clearly the most quirky. I backed into this thing on intelligence. They were all very intelligent. That was very, very clear. a lot of them also had very distinct signs of what we would think of as a dopamine irregularity. So maybe a little bit of elevated dopamine or volatile dopamine. I mean, Nikola Tesla was flat out manic and had, obsessive compulsive disorder. So he had some pretty extreme dopamine irregularities. But having modestly elevated dopamine is really valuable for creativity because it causes divergent thinking, and it also lowers latent inhibition, which means you don't screen out as much stuff and you get more defocused attention and you're incorporating more stimuli than you would normally. So we know that modestly elevated dopamine is related to creativity. And in fact, there was a really interesting thing that happened when I was doing this study. I started this, remember, in 2010. And one of my colleagues came to me and he said, did you hear that they've discovered that when people have Parkinson's, it can open up a whole creative genius thing that they never knew they had. They might become artists or sculptors or whatever. And I thought about it for a minute, and really quickly I thought, it's not the Parkinson's, it's the levodopa they're giving them, because levodopa is synthetic dopamine, and probably when they first get on this levodopa, they've probably got elevated dopamine. And sure enough, a few months later, they did another study and they're like, oh, it's the levodopa. But so I felt very vindicated in that.
No kidding.
But this elevated dopamine also facilitates working memory and executive function. So this one neurotransmitter that can enhance creativity can also enhance intelligence and processing. So they have an underlying common basis, right? And it's also the case that when you have long working memory or even good exceptional long-term memory, you'll follow longer paths of association. You are capable of following longer paths of association out. So for instance, Kimball Musk refers to Elon Musk, his brother, saying, he's always thinking 10 steps out. So he's arriving somewhere that other people haven't even thought of yet, right? And he turns out to be right. And you would see that he's right if you followed him all 10 steps out. And that's really facilitated by being intelligent. Now, that doesn't mean that all creative people are geniuses or that all geniuses are creative, but it does mean that there are some common elements that help with both. Now, take that modestly elevated dopamine and look at what happens when you make it really extreme. You start getting things like schizophrenia, right? You get mania, you can get obsessive compulsive disorder, but schizophrenia, the positive affect schizophrenia, when people have word salad and they're gibbering and they're hearing things, that's from having really, really elevated dopamine. So, so you can see that connection. Now you can say families that have historically generated more creative geniuses have also historically created more schizophrenics. So we knew about that genetic link long before we understood the neurotransmitters that underlie that connection.
Yet again, it kind of points to the fact that on some of these serial breakthrough innovators, they might have that characteristic, but it's almost like it's the perfect balance of that character, right? Too much, and you venture into schizophrenia territory. Too little, and maybe they aren't as driven to be so creative and wild in their thinking.
We'll get right back to our holiday special in just a little bit, but before we go on, I do want to add one little thing, a gift you can give to us. We do this every once in a while. We have our yearly survey for you, and since our listeners are, we know, such techies, this year it's going to focus on how you use collaborative software at work, something we'd like to know. The survey's brief, shouldn't take you more than 6 minutes. We do not, and I really underscore this because it's important for me, and I know it's important for you, collect any personal data. All we ask is that you go to twit.to/survey12 for the 12th month, I guess. twit.to/survey12. And if you do that, great. You don't have to, but if you do it, it would be a nice gift for us, and it would help us a little bit in planning our future endeavors, if you know what I mean. And now, on with the show.
I came up with the idea for a magazine that covered technology the way Rolling Stone covered music. And that idea turned into Wired. And I wasn't the person who made it happen. I just was the person who had a similar idea and happened to run into the person who made it happen, who brought me on board as a partner, and off we went. And then from there, lots of chaos ensued.
So did you actually run into that? I mean, that's part of the lore that like you were the guy they roped in from Berkeley because you had done a project that was what I read about, creating the Rolling Stone for the digital age. Like, did you actually just run in, or did they seek you out, or did you seek them out? Tell us more about that.
Well, they sought. It's a funny story. They sought me out, but only after they sought out a guy that I worked with at that magazine we just discussed, Mac Week, the Macintosh magazine. They sought him out first. He was older, more senior, and they offered him the job that I ultimately took. And he said no. And he said no because he thought, it was like a fly-by-night startup with like no funding and, just 2 or 3 crazy people in a, rundown warehouse, full of garbage. I mean, it was really not something that if you were a responsible person with kids, you would have taken this offer, right? So he said, but I know someone. And he's just graduating from Berkeley. He's a great guy, a lot of energy. And so he gave them my number. And I was like up in the Sierra Nevada backpacking or something. And I came back through a small town on my way home and checked my voicemail. I mean, you used to have to do that. You stop at a payphone and like check your voicemail. And there was a message from this guy, Louis Rossetto, from a place called Wired. And I was doing a lot of freelance writing to put myself through graduate school. And I thought he was like a PR guy, and Wired was probably some networking company that he wanted to pitch me. And I almost deleted it. But I thought, if it was a decent story, I always need money. I was going to move to New York and try to write for all those publications. So, you never know. So I call him back. And he proceeded to pitch me the idea that I had pitched to the Graduate School of Journalism as my master's thesis. I mean, it was literally the same idea. And I was like, oh, my God, are you really doing this? And he's like, yeah. And I'm like, where are you? Can I meet you? And so I went in and met with him and Kevin Kelly. And the 3 of us became the editors that started Wired. I mean, as soon as I walked into that office, I was like, I'm so in. It's so in. This is going to be awesome. It was like forming a band, It really was. It was like, I can play music with these guys, Let's go write some music.
So is there a garage story? Where did you guys start? Did you start you started in San Francisco?
We started on the top floor of a warehouse in what is in South Park in San Francisco, which is a now very famous sort of startup ghetto. Back then, as I understand it, I did not source or find the building. But when I walked into it, you had to step over the junkies and, literally it was full of garbage. The garbage had kind of been cleared into the back of the warehouse. But it was very, very inexpensive real estate. It's now some of the most expensive real estate in San Francisco. But in 1992, it was, south of Market by about 5 or 6 blocks. Off the beaten path, but a big airy loft kind of warehouse situation, and lots of room to grow. And we stayed in that 2 South Park space for a couple of years until we outgrew it and went 1 block over to the other side of South Park, where Wired still is today. At least the San Francisco offices are on 3rd Street.
Mm. So, yeah, I remember I worked on 3rd Street in 99. So then I worked in the same building as the Wired.com.
Yeah, that was down the street.
Yeah.
Louis, I think, was really a very, he had a very clear sense of where he thought the future was going. And in 1993, after we had some initial success with the magazine, it became very evident how important the internet was. And so we wanted to do an internet version of the magazine. And we had an argument between calling it Wired.com or calling it Hot Wired and making an entirely new brand and reinventing everything just for the internet because it's a new medium, and why you can't just take one medium and put it on the next medium, right? That's the mistake that they made with radio plays on television and so on. So we decided to not only make an entirely new brand, Hot Wired, we would have it in an entirely different building. And so that was the building that you went to, because that was, their space and so they basically were, told to go figure it out, and we, as the original founders of the company, would manage them. But they basically, ran a pirate ship over there.
Yeah. I couldn't remember what it was called. I remember it wasn't Wired.com. Yeah, it was Hotwired, and they did Code Monkey and all those things.
So many. And we actually, we would have management meetings. And I remember one of them where, we had hired, I think, somewhere about 40 staff at Hotwired, 40, which was more than we had on the magazine. And during this meeting, which is only 5 of us, right? The question arose, how are we going to pay them? We'd hired them, so now what, right? And reasonable question, I think, to ask is, and I was the managing editor of the magazine and overall of the what we call Wired Ventures, which owned all the operating companies, including Hotwired. It's like, how are we going to pay these people? And we needed a business model for Hotwired, for the online site. And given that it was one of the first online sites that was commercial in the world, there was GNN, which is O'Reilly's site, and Yahoo had, I think, just launched, but it was very early. We just invented in that meeting what became the banner ad. And I'll never forget, Lewis, I suggested this banner ad, but I suggested putting it at the bottom of the screen because I was basically stealing the idea from an online service called Prodigy, which maybe some people listening would remember. And Lewis said, no, let's not put it at the bottom. Let's put it at the top so that people can scroll it out of the way. And I thought that was genius, It's just like people could flip the page on the magazine and, make it go away, make the ad go away, right? And then, of course, the technology question arose, which is how are we going to serve this ad, where we use the same, content management system that we had built to serve our, HTML content, our web editorial content. And the decision was taken that would be crazy. We have to, because, remember, I was a journalist and I had a master's degree in journalism. We had to separate the lines between church and state. So we created a different technology infrastructure for the advertising as opposed to the content. And that created an ad server. And the rest is kind of history. The ad tech business, DoubleClick, that entire kind of the bifurcation between content and advertising and the whole ad tech infrastructure that has built up, the tens of billions of dollar industry around that, started with, should we put the ad tech together with the content tech or not? And if you look at the one company that has essentially reintegrated them, right, so that the ad and the content tech is the same, it's Facebook. Oh. And there's a whole 20-year history between that meeting at Wired and today, where my career, has to do with trying to integrate those two sides in a business model that doesn't destroy everything it touches. But those are the two endpoints: the decision in that meeting and Facebook today.
The title of the book, of course, is How to Turn Down $1 Billion, and which sounds like a ridiculous thing for anyone to ever do if they're ever in that position. I don't know if I could have done it, but it was very interesting to read about the relationship aspects between Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg and Evan Spiegel, particularly. And somehow I missed this over time, but so it was really interesting to kind of do some web searches and read about this even more. It was how little Evan seemed to care that he was being contacted out of the blue by Mark Zuckerberg. There was an email kind of exchange, and it really just seemed like Evan was like, yeah, whatever. If I'm in the area, I'll give you a call. Where does Evan's confidence in that decision come from? I feel like anybody would get an email like that from Mark Zuckerberg, and automatically, whether you're interested in a deal or not, automatically you'd be very interested in the fact that Zuckerberg is emailing you. That wasn't the case with Evan. Why do you think that was?
For sure. Part of it's definitely Evan's personality and this sort of cocky, brash personality that drove Snapchat from this silly college room idea to a real Facebook rival. Part of it is also the fact that I think they really saw Snapchat once Zuckerberg contacted them, and they sort of had this impermanence angle as the anti-Facebook and as a company that was fixing what they believe Facebook had created a bad social environment, and that Snapchat was sort of fixing that. And so I think it was sort of this mission of you're doing it wrong, we can do it better. And so we don't have the reverence for you because you're not doing it right.
Yeah, right. And so, of course, those talks went nowhere, obviously. Facebook eventually, and not very long after, launched their app called Poke. I remember Poke. It was not very impressive, but it was obvious that Facebook was trying to, Facebook is good at this, right? Or at least they think they're good at this. They recognize that a competitor, a close competitor, is doing something very interesting, very different, and seemingly almost immediately come up with their own version of it. They don't always succeed. Poke was one of those where they didn't. But I mean, right after that release, Snapchat goes on to basically pummel Facebook in the App Store with Poke. Why did Poke fail so hard when it was trying to basically emulate the things that made Snapchat successful?
Yeah, it took Facebook a while, several years from Poke until they finally hit on something with Instagram stories.
Right.
To really understand what Snapchat was succeeding with and how they could copy at least parts of it. So the problem with Poke was a perfect clone of Snapchat. It had every feature Snapchat had. It looked like Snapchat. You could even do more actually in Poke than you could in Snap. The problem was that all the people on Snapchat were using it in part because it wasn't Facebook, right? So Facebook had your parents, all these different people, old people, real adults. And so you weren't posting as much fun things you used to when you were younger. And Snapchat was like your college friends, your high school friends, small group of buddies, and you all posted like really fun things to each other and sent fun things to each other. And so for current Snapchat users, they were like, well, why would I already have my close friends on this app. It's like this weird kooky culture that I like. Why would I go download Facebook Poke and invite outsiders into this club? And then for older people, they didn't understand the appeal of Snapchat in the first place. So they were like, okay, Facebook has this weird sexting impermanent app. I'm 35. Why am I going to go download this? And so they really built an app for no one. And I think that was borne out in the fact that very few people downloaded it and quickly died.
Yeah. And Evan went on to call it a Christmas gift. For Snapchat. Happened right around Christmas time. Really seems like that was a point where the perception of Facebook, or at least probably from Evan and team's perspective, shifted to become, I don't know, what did it shift towards? Something, a more serious tool, less of a, is that when Snapchat officially kind of was able to leave the whole sexting perspective in everybody's dialogue behind and move into being a more serious product? Yeah, so it before the sort of narrative was, there's this weird sexting app that's really popular among high schoolers and college kids, what's happening, this is bad. Yeah. And then when Facebook created a clone, it was it totally shifted the conversation to, oh, okay, Facebook copied this. Impermanence must be the next big thing. And so the combination of Facebook copying it and then Snapchat defeating them really validated Snapchat in a big way and created a ton of growth potential for them. And it also sort of positioned Facebook as this sort of 800-pound gorilla in the room. Within about a year and a half, they had bought Instagram for $1 billion, tried to acquire Snapchat, brutally copied them to try to kill them, and then bought WhatsApp for $19 billion. And so that kind of combination of events all in a row is sort of okay, Snapchat is going to do anything and everything it can to try to just dominate this space. It kind of felt like the end of Goodfellas where where they're rounding up all the people involved in the heist and killing them off one by one. It was anyone who's any success in social or messaging is either coming into the Facebook family or getting whacked. Yep, absolutely. And I mean, that wasn't the only time that Facebook approached Evan Spiegel for some sort of a relationship. The big one that we all heard about, and man, I remember hearing about this and just scratching my head and being like, how do you turn it down? Zuckerberg offered $3 billion to Evan for Snapchat. Is that confirmed by either Snapchat or Facebook, by the way, or is this something that hit the news and we think we know, but we don't know exactly?
It hasn't. I don't think that either company's like come out with a press release like, "Yep, this happened,"
or any sort of acknowledgement.
Yeah, but it's been confirmed by multiple sources. Multiple reporters have had multiple sources confirm it. Okay. And then when the Sony hack happened over the James Franco, Seth Rogen movie, The Interview, the CEO of Sony was on Snapchat's board, and so a ton of board level emails leaked out. And one of those, a few of those were about Facebook's offer. So. It's as good as at this point.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Why? So, I mean, you have to have a lot of confidence about your product then when somebody offers you, probably the biggest name in social media, let's say, and social media, whether Snapchat is social media or not, that could be debated, but the biggest name in your direct competitive field, offers you $3 billion. If you're turning it down, it's because you have the utmost confidence in your product. But that had to have been a difficult decision, right? You don't make that decision. That's not an easy decision to make. How do you think they were able to kind of what was their rationale to say, you know what, we can do this better?
Yeah, absolutely. It was not at all an easy decision. We sort of see the publicly facing brash Evan who's like, we're the best, kind of like a Muhammad Ali saying they're the champ. But in those board level emails we just talked about, one of the board members talks about how Evan sort of was waffling back and forth day after day going, oh, just tell us this is so much money versus, okay, well, I'm going to go it alone. Like, we've got this. So it was a really difficult decision. What was really interesting was about a month before the offer, Snapchat launched Stories, which was its feed product. And that started taking off really quickly. Within a year, it was more popular than the messaging app. And so I think they had an early inkling that something's happening here. Sort of the early data showed people are using this. This is going to do well. And that also had a much better monetization potential, as you could put ads into a feed like any other social feed. And so I think they kind of knew there's a good shot here that within a year or two, we have created something that's more valuable than just the messaging app. And I think they also just had confidence in the team, confidence in the idea that impermanence had a place here and that people were going to really enjoy using this. And so, but yeah, it was definitely scary, especially when the first time they turned down Facebook, they just got cloned right away. And Zuckerberg was definitely going to keep copying them, keep coming after them. And so turn them down and realize the sort of battle you're going into took a lot of guts.
Yeah, right. And I don't know. It's no longer too soon to tell whether it was a good or a bad idea. Like the company is now public. By all accounts, I'm sure Evan and Bobby are pretty thrilled with the position that they're at. It hasn't been an easy road necessarily. This year has had a lot of challenges. Do you think, I don't know. What do you think? Do you think I would be really surprised if they weren't 100% behind their decision to turn down $3 billion. But do you think deep down they feel that way right now in light of everything that's happened?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I think if you look, I think when they went public, the market cap was roughly 11 times what the Facebook offer was. Mm-hmm. Although it's funny if you do a little back of the envelope map, had they taken the offer fully in Facebook stock, Facebook's been on a tear since then too, and so it would have been nice to be paid $3 billion in Facebook stock in 2013. But I think more than that, dollar wise, I don't think Evan and Bobby are counting up nickels at the end of the day on what's the biggest amount of money they can make. I think they really enjoy this company on their own. They really enjoy. You look at some of the things Evan's written and spoken about social media and Facebook recently. I think they really enjoy running this on their own. And we saw this with WhatsApp, where Jan Koum, one of the founders, who made a lot of money signed to Facebook, said it's time to delete Facebook. And I wonder if they regret selling, and if Kevin Systrom at Instagram or anyone who sort of sold to Facebook wishes they had their independent company back in. And so I think more than anything else right now, with all the turmoil happening at Facebook and all the questions that people are asking around the future of social media and tech's influence in our lives, I think Evan and Bobby are really happy that they get to run an independent company. Yeah, it turns out with the turn of events in recent months, they've got to be pretty happy to be on their own and not be involved in this heavy conversation that keeps happening. I feel like every day it's a new bit of information about Facebook.
All right, so the most important kind of phase that we're in right now in technology news cycle and journalism and politics. I mean, it's all pointing to this idea of how easy our technology is to kind of shape, form fit, manipulate, to misinform. And that kind of seems to, thankfully Snopes is there, although I don't know if you were super happy to have to take on this gargantuan challenge, which is to be one of the very few companies online who's dedicated to really proving that some of these highly charged news stories, these claims, all this stuff that's happening in the politics space right now is true or false. So, fake news is a big deal. Back in 2012, kind of prior to all the fake news stuff, factcheck.org quoted you as saying you'd be hard-pressed to find two more apolitical people. Of course, you were talking about you and your then-wife, Barbara Mickelson. Has the era of fake news changed that for you?
Well, I'll tell you an amusing anecdote. It was one of my hobbies in my increasingly vanishing free time is board gaming. Yes. So there was a fellow in one of my board gaming groups about the same age as me, a pediatrician, who was telling me one day about how his father, who was then in his 80s, was getting increasingly enmeshed in Fox News and kept sending him links to all these stories about Barack Obama was born in Kenya and he's a radical Muslim who attended a madrasa, and so my friend would send his father back links to Snopes patiently. And he said one day his father replied and said, well, why should we trust them? I mean, you don't know what their agenda is. You don't know who they are. So he replied to his father, well, Dad, actually, I do know who they are. I've been over to their house, and they're not really very political. So, yes. So, prior to doing this, politics was not really an interest of mine at all. It really only became it to the extent of, having to be up on it to do what we do. But, I had never and still have not, worked for a political campaign, advocated on behalf of any candidate, not to the extent of sticking a sign in my front yard or putting a bumper sticker on my car. Right. I have never donated to a political party or campaign or candidate, despite people's attempts to try and claim that we have, but no.
Well, you mentioned that's one of the things that we've kind of heard in the past, or rather that people have charged or questioned, is this idea of bias on the site, and are you left leaning or right leaning? And I mean, what you're saying today is that you kind of you approach the problem. You don't necessarily, it sounds like, approach it from either side. But how do you well, I guess if you're making both sides angry, then you're probably doing it right?
Yeah, well, it was sort of an interesting phenomenon that for a very long time, probably, 95% of the political stuff we were coming across in the wild, so to speak, on the internet was anti-liberal, anti-democratic for whatever reasons we could only guess at. And it's really only within the last, 4 years or so, I'd say 4 to 6 years, kind of like the other side has caught up, and where it's now kind of evenly divided between, the two sides attacking each other. So for a very long time, 90% of what we were writing about was, anti-liberal, anti-democratic, and it's kind of a hallmark that, 90% of what we're writing about tends to be outright false, if not grossly exaggerated, no matter who it originated with. So it kind of created that perception that, well, all you're doing is taking stuff about liberals and saying it's false, so you're obviously liberal, but that just happened to be the nature of the material. I mean, now we have, Occupy Democrats and a whole lot of other, left-leaning sites and, Facebook groups out there that are competing in the political arena. So, it's a pretty evenly mixed bag now.
Alas, Father Robert Ballecer has moved on to a higher power. No, he's not dead. He's gone to the Vatican, where he is in charge of like the Vatican social media outreach. He's building a podcast studio. And here's the good news. He's not gone from TWIT. We're going to see him in January. He's coming out for CES and many other conferences, including DEF CON in the fall. So we'll see lots more of Father Robert Ballecer. I do miss him on Triangulation, though. I loved his wit, his style, his brains. And he did a great interview that we're going to give you a chance to see a little bit of right now. Father Robert talking about AI. It's coming for you.
Let's actually talk about the second major section of your book. It's when you actually go into AI. And I'm so happy that you did this. You made a point of defining AI, at least the AI that we think we know right now, as narrow AI. What exactly does it mean? What do you define as narrow AI?
So AI is a hard term. It doesn't really have a meaning that you can kind of point to and say. And it's a bad term kind of for two reasons: the word artificial and the word intelligence. Other than that, it's great. The man who created the term later regretted it. But what we do know is that whatever you call it, there are two distinctly different ideas. And one is what we have today, which is narrow AI, and that is an artificial intelligence that can do one thing: a spam filter in your inbox, the thing that routes your car to the destination, the sprinkler system that comes on when the yard's dry, whatever. It can do one thing. The kind of AI that when you hear people say, we're doomed, it's going to kill us all, that's something that doesn't exist yet. It's called general artificial intelligence, and it is an AI that is as smart and versatile as a human being. So it's like an AI MacGyver. You ask it to fix a coffee maker, it'll go do it. You ask it if you should break up with your boyfriend or girlfriend, it will tell you. I mean, it's completely versatile, and we don't know how to make that. And that's the thing that people are afraid of, because they think that if we ever make it, and it's digital, that it'll very quickly be twice as smart as us, then 4, then 8, then 16, then 32, and 64, and then eventually it doesn't even recognize us. It lives at a different time scale and whatnot. But that is, we know we can build narrow AI. It's everywhere, but we don't know if we can build a general AI. And that, to my mind, is an open question. And that's one of the questions that I try to address with the 3 foundational questions I ask at the beginning of the book.
Right. And all the AI systems, at least what we've been calling AI systems, that drive self-driving cars, learning machines, translators that learn from their mistakes, that's all narrow. But for some reason, we think that's sci-fi AI, that it will just continue to grow, it will continue to expand. But you make a point in your book in saying, look, narrow AI is great. Narrow AI it's useful, but it's incredibly constrained. By its design, it's constrained. You will never have a narrow AI that becomes general. It just can't, because we don't even know how to design that yet. We don't even know what is a design for that might look like. So we deal with narrow AI. We live in a world of narrow AI. My question to you would be, how do we get people to understand that? How do we get people to understand that there actually is this chasm between what sci-fi would say AI is and what we actually have on a daily basis?
I don't know.
That's a great answer. That's a great answer. But what's the damage from people not knowing that?
Well, I think that is very real, in the sense that we can use narrow AI to cure disease and learn how to save energy and learn how to live more sustainably and how to build better roads and grow better food. And I mean, you have so many applications of it. You have tractors that have little cameras on the side that when they spot a weed, they just spray that one weed with insecticide, so they're not spraying the whole field, just when they find a weed. You have, you just have so many applications of it, and all of them are, I think, almost all of them doing good for humanity. The minute somebody says we should be afraid of AI, all of that, all the air kind of gets sucked out of the room, and all of the kind of enthusiasm behind all of these really good projects just gets what you were saying a minute ago, just a little bit of caution interjected into it, and it slows it down just a little bit. And that, in a very real sense, can, cause people to die, right? I mean, like, if we just said, no, we're afraid of the technology, let's just, turn off all the computers, that is bad for people, and that is bad for humans.
Right. Of course, artificial general intelligence. We'll get to that a little bit later. We can get to the scary stories that have been developed about what that might lead to. But there is a bit more fact-based concerns. I won't even call them fears. I'll call them concerns about what narrow AI might actually do. And this is more pragmatic. These are people who are seeing what automation is doing, and they're saying, wait a minute, are we getting to a point where we're going to make humans obsolete? Are we getting to a point where I'm designing robots and narrow AIs that will take my job? What would you want to say to those people?
Well, in the book, I cover all three of those viewpoints. The viewpoint that is exactly what will happen. And then the viewpoint that, no, it will take every job. It'll write better poetry and be a better president and act better in movies, everything. And then the view that, no, that's all preposterous. I will say that you may have heard a study that gets thrown around a lot, an Oxford study, a fine study that says 47% of jobs are going to be replaced by automation, or at least that's how it's reported. The interesting thing is that the writers of the study go out of their way to say, we're not saying that at all. What we're saying is 47% of the things that people do in their jobs may be automated. And that's not particularly news, right? If you look back 20 years, probably 47% of things that people did in their office job has been automated. I mean, that's not particularly news. If you look, though, there's an OECD study, that nonpartisan, multinational, that said what entire jobs can be replaced by machines, then they came up with the number 9%. I have a robot job test on my website, byronreese.com, and it asks you 10 questions about a job, and you can answer, how much mobility does it require, how much empathy, and all of that. You can answer it, and we find virtually no jobs are where the entire job is going to be replaced by automation, and there's a big misconception also about how that works, and it goes like this. Imagine a series of jobs from really high-skilled ones up here all the way down to just like, an order taker at a fast food place, a low-skilled job. And here's what people say. They say automation's really good at creating awesome new high-end jobs like a geneticist. And what it does is it destroys all these low-skilled jobs like order taker at a restaurant. And then here's the part I think is where the shell game part happens. They say, do you really think that person who was an order taker at a restaurant is going to become a geneticist?
Right.
And the answer to that is no, not at all. That isn't how it works. What happens is a college professor becomes a geneticist. The high school teacher goes and works for the college. The substitute teacher gets hired on full time, all the way down. So the question isn't, can that order taker become a geneticist? The question is, this is the important part, can everybody do a job just a little harder than the job they're doing today? If the answer to that is yes, which I believe is true, then every time technology creates a job at the high end, everybody gets a promotion. Everybody goes up a notch. And so for 250 years, this is exactly what has happened. For 250 years in this country, we have had full employment, other than the Depression, and we've had rising wages. And the way that that's happened for 250 years is automation and technology creates great new jobs, destroys really bad jobs, and everybody goes up a notch. And that is, there's no reason in the world to think that that is not going to continue to happen that way for the next 250 years. This idea somehow that when you think of what a person can do, and you take something like a waiter who has to go and take an order, and then they have to answer questions, and then they have to clean up baby spit up and clean up a fallen drink, and then give somebody the Heimlich. I don't know. I mean, there's this like incredible range of things that humans can do, and robots can't. I mean, they simply cannot. They are tolerably good at repetitive motion that never changes. And other than that, humans hands down, There's not a robot that can duplicate what a 3-year-old can do, let alone what an adult can do. And so I think what happens is these studies come out, and then it sells. It gets clicks when they say Oxford says 47% of jobs will be lost to automation.
Well, fear
and then
sells. Fear always sells.
It scares people, and I'm at a point where I think it's deliberate, not in any conspiratorial sense, but and you just do that enough and enough and enough, and people lose confidence, and I think they kind of lose the big picture that this is good for everybody. All these great new jobs mean we all get to go up a notch, and we all get a raise, and we all get a promotion. Why? Because technology makes us more productive, and the way that wages rise is through increasing productivity. We don't make more money because we work twice as many hours. We do it compared to 100 years ago. We do it because our work is twice as productive, and that's and if automation is the villain, then assembly lines are bad, and nail guns are bad, and if automation's the villain, then you want to make everybody kind of work with their hands like frozen in ice water, so they work much slower, and then you need more people, and you need to outlaw machines, you need to outlaw tractors, and all of that, and you'll create an enormous number of jobs, and the standard of living will plummet because everybody's productivity goes down. So to vilify automation is to turn your back on 250 years of history. Now, people will hear that and they will say, this time is different. This time is different. They'll either say it's happening much faster now. That's kind of one tack. Or they'll say it's going after the thinking jobs and not just the physical jobs. And interestingly, the idea that this time is different also was common in the 60s and common in the 30s and common at the beginning. But I think each of those two arguments, that it's faster now or that it's going after a different kind of work, I think they're both spurious as well. That being said, I give them a full airing, and in the book, I mean, I want the reader to take their answers to those 3 questions and kind of work through it. And if in the end you believe people are machines, then maybe someday we'll build a mechanical person. And if we ever can build a mechanical person, then maybe that mechanical person will be better than an organic person. But if you don't believe people are machines, then that there is something substantially different between a human being and a machine, then the machines are never going to be able to do what we do.
So you finished your PhD, and was that when you were approached to work on Minority Report?
Yeah, it was one of those confluences that's just so ridiculous that it can only happen in the real world. I'd finished my dissertation some months before and was kind of tidying up and publishing and doing the things you do while you figure out the next step. And Minority Report at that point just got really and truly and finally and fully green-lit. It had tried to get off the ground once or twice previously, once even with Spielberg, but this time it was going to happen for real. And one of the pre-production activities was that the film's production designer, an extraordinary guy named Alex McDowell, was flying around the country, basically visiting as many industrial labs and universities as he could, looking for advanced technology, sort of tech just on the cusp that would be both recognizable today, sort of, and could clearly extrapolate into the future with which to populate this world, because Spielberg's brief to him, probably terrifyingly, was, this has to be a completely real world. I don't want it to feel like sci-fi. I want it to feel like this is just what you get if you wait around 50 years and drive to Washington, D.C. It looks like this. So, wow, what a long segue and intro. So there's Alex and the prop master, Jerry Moss, stopping by the Media Lab, and I just sort of got into this hours-long discussion with him, and he looked at the luminous room stuff, and at some point he said, yeah, I think this set of ideas probably solves one of our hardest design problems on Minority Report, which is Stephen wants to know what computers are going to look like how do we operate them in 50 years?
So it was 2025. Is that the year it takes place?
2054.
2050.
As it hits the streets. But when we started, it was set in 2080. And there was a moment when Steven said, it's just too far. We can't predict. And he's right. We can barely predict 2 years ahead at this point. And so he felt like 80 years was too much. We pulled it back to 2044. And then for some reason that I've never gotten a good answer to or never been able to figure out, right at the last minute, we went up by 10 years to 2054. Okay. So if you look really carefully, you can see a little bit of ADR or looping, putting different dates into actors' mouths to make the calendar math work out.
So they came to you and they wanted to see what computers looked like. So were you in charge of all of the technology, like the big advertising screens, and what about the cars and stuff? Yeah,
ultimately it was my job to make sure that all of the technology that would appear in the film knitted together, that it seemed to be, in fact, from a single, consistent, coherent future that you would get to by just waiting around for 50 years, as I said, and instead of being patched together. So that was a pretty broad charter. That didn't mean that I had to design everything, and a film is a village and takes a village, and there's lots and lots of insanely talented people involved, including a bunch of outside consultants on the film. But that kind of knit it together job was a big one, and often I was in the position of explaining how something would work. So the cars were designed by Harold Belker, but how would a car both drive on a horizontal surface and then drive up the side of a wall? Mm-hmm. Well, what you get to pretty quickly, and what I started unearthing and extrapolating, is maglev, right? It's a propulsion technology that's been in development in Japan and Germany and a few other places for quite a while now. A non-contact thing that would have exactly those properties. And what's so exciting and fun about working that way, like, let's not just imagine the surface, but let's explain the tech all the way down, and let's intersect that tech explanation with political explanation and sociological and anthropological and political explanation and aesthetic explanation and advertising, which runs the whole Minority Report world. What you get are these tendrils that kind of interleave and have a lot of really fun, unexpected consequences that feel like the real world. And that's why it's worth going that deep.
So was there anything that you had got just from the Philip K. Dick story that wasn't from the script that you were given? Not very much. I mean, if you go back and read the short story, which I did just a few years ago, there's not much there. It's very, very bare bones, and a lot of the characters are changed. The script itself went through so many iterations. Even the who ended up being the heavy. In the end, the revelation about who'd been mucking with the system went through different transformations along the way. So there's the key piece from the script that remains is, of course, the idea of the three precogs, the psychic teenagers who, woe be to them, have to lie in a bath and dream of violent crime all day long. So that's basically it. There was a set of MacGuffins around punch cards, which were like the 1960s version of the hard copy / data or evidence from the analysis of the precogs that kind of transformed into the wooden balls in the film, but there wasn't a whole lot else other than names. Well, and it's funny because I just recently rewatched it. Like, I don't know that I'd seen it since it came out, but I had totally forgotten the biology aspect of it, the precogs, that there's so much, that there's, I think of it as a movie where like, oh yeah, so much of that has come true. But really it's, what's come true is the sort of pre-crime and like using algorithms to be able to predict who's gonna, who you need to arrest, who you need to look after. And then just the fact, just the gesturing that we see a lot of, But yeah, so what you've created really is what sticks with people. Just the screen that everyone remembers and moving things around. And we'll get to Oblong Industries, which is your business and how that relates to that. But I don't know. I've forgotten what my question was. Okay, and I wanted to ask about you had created, you created an entire sort of, it's not like you just created sets for this. This is an entire basically operating system, and you created a manual for it as well?
Yeah, I mean, I had to create and publish a bunch of artifacts that would train the actors, and not just the actors, but give clues to the director and the people who are building props and costumes and the rest of it, how this system would work. And it went further too. I mean, I'd never worked on a film before, so I was incredibly naive. I didn't know how anyone else would go about doing this, and so I did the only thing I knew how to do, which is to design the system somewhat painstakingly, as if it would need to get built, right? As if the next step was going to be to actually implement this, because we'd been building stuff like it at MIT, and there was a moment when I had to decide whether to actually try to build it so it could work on set on the day as the cameras rolled, or let the visual effects people composite the stuff in later. And we went with choice B, which is a good idea, given the film context. But except for the fact that it wasn't implemented as running code, it was a very, very real system. It was a complete kind of domain-specific control language, gestural control language, assembled from bits and pieces of American Sign Language and, SWAT team and police command stuff and ground air traffic control signals and a bunch of other stuff that is real and that humans use to communicate with each other. And then, all that gets distilled down to kind of a dictionary or a thesaurus that's handed out to the team and the actors, and I ended up making a training video as well, so that people could watch and see what it would look like. Which means that on the day when you're shooting those scenes, there's real intentionality. There's real causality there. The actors know what they're doing. They know why they're doing it. They know what they would be seeing on the screen, and they know what their characters will be looking at on the screen when the film comes out. And that kind of that level of that dedication to verisimilitude, I think, is what finally kind of comes bursting through the other end.
So let's talk a little bit. We're going to wrap it up. This morning, right before the interview, the U.S. Supreme Court kind of shocked me by ruling that law enforcement should not have access to cell phone location information without a warrant, without probable cause, eliminating a massive market in cell phone location information, selling it to law enforcement. I'm sure AT&T and Verizon and T-Mobile and Sprint are all pissed off. But doing a lot to protect our privacy. We've seen law enforcement, the FBI, complain again and again that they're going dark, that encryption tools like yours have given them less access to criminal activity. But on the other hand, there is a law called Zimmerman's Law that as technology increases, the ability to surveil will increase. Which is it?
Yeah. There is... so much, it's the golden age of surveillance. There's surveillance everywhere. There's cameras on the streets. You see this in London and also in China, where you have millions of cameras on every street corner, looking at people walking by. And behind those cameras are facial recognition algorithms. And so you can identify everyone walking down the street, everyone, thousands of people walking by, you can identify all of them. And this power increases over time. But it's also traffic cameras that read license plates of cars. If you run a red light, you can get a ticket, which is good. For that purpose, maybe that's okay. But they're also using it to keep track of where all the cars are going, so that you can just track people everywhere they drive their car. And then, of course, we're embracing self-driving cars, and those are in constant touch with servers that keep track of where you are. And they'll tell you where the next place you could plug in to recharge your batteries. And so what we have is, and plus there's, credit card transactions and airline tickets, and, there's this vast sea of surveillance, and it's fused together into this kind of total information awareness. And this is the golden age of surveillance. And for them to demand that we not have end-to-end encryption, it's kind of like this big display where there's just a few black pixels where they can't see it. And I don't want to hand over the last few pixels to them just so they have a completely flawless display where they have 100% of the pixels covered. I'd rather hang tenaciously on to these last few pixels and I can't do anything about a lot of the other surveillance they have, but I think they've got it pretty easy. Where they're not going dark. Having a few tiny little pixels left for us and our privacy it's not going dark.
Phil Zimmerman, God bless you. Thank you so much for the work you've done and are doing, and for preserving those last few pixels. We've always said that the third leg of the stool in this show is the chat room. But today we actually have a triumvirate, and I'm so thrilled. First, let's introduce our guest, who will be new to some of you, not to all of you. Siva Vaidyanathan is a professor of media studies at the University of Virginia and author of a book called Anti-Social Media, How Facebook Disconnects Us and Undermines Democracy. Just came out a week ago. And is a, well, I'll let Siva describe it, but it is a screed against Facebook, I guess is probably the best way to describe it. We're not just alone, because I thought I need some ammunition, and I thought this would be a kind of a great opportunity to bring in the king of techno-panic himself, the professor of, he's reading the book right now, the professor of journalism at the City University of New York, Jeff Jarvis. He's, of course, a co-host with us on Twig at blogs at BuzzFeed, has written a few of his own books, including Public Parts and What Would Google Do. Jeff, Siva, welcome. I know you guys know each other well. In fact, we've been on shows together.
Great to be back.
Yeah.
In fact, can I just begin with a disclosure and a compliment?
Yes.
Disclosure is that my school accepted money from Facebook to start the News Integrity Initiative, but I am independent of them, as I hope I'll demonstrate. And second, I have no more favorite sparring partner in the earth, and I mean this, than Siva. Siva is always smart and rational and reasoned. He's sometimes wrong, but often right. And I could imagine nothing better to aspire to. So I'm honored to be here with you, Siva. I got the book, and I'm dashing through, and I've read about a quarter of it. And as always, it's wonderfully written, and everyone out there should buy it and then argue with it.
And well-reasoned. Well-reasoned, yeah.
I hope so.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, I can't disagree that it's a screed, although screed might imply that it's a bit unhinged. I hope it's still hinged.
It's a hinged screed.
But it was written passionately.
Yeah.
And I'm still deeply immersed. I think it's a story of a heartbreak, right? I think it's a story of good intentions gone terribly wrong. Ultimately, I think what I hope you take away from the book is that Facebook was designed for a better species than ours, and we have not lived up, and we probably can't live up to the design of Facebook, the notion that such a rich level of connectivity, such a process of algorithmic amplification, and this really powerful and effective and efficient advertising system that has, altered so many different areas of life, is just not something that we were prepared to behave well with, right? We're a huge species, and there are 2.2 billion of us operating on Facebook regularly. A good number of that 2.2 billion people are pretty bad people. And a good number of those people have figured out ways to hijack Facebook, and use it in very destructive ways, spread garbage in ways that get amplified, and target garbage in ways that hit very sensitive groups and people. It's not a story that's unfamiliar to anybody who watches this, right? It's not a story to anybody who's familiar with breaking news in the past year and a half. What I tried to do was dig a bit deeper into the ideologies and the ideas and the histories beneath it. What I failed to do ultimately is come up with a roadmap forward that I believe in.
We're all struggling with that. We're all struggling with that a little bit.
Yeah.
Before we get to, first of all, a couple of things. This is not going to be a traditional, forensics debate. Although I understand Jeff, just back from Aspen, where he did in fact engage in a debate on this subject
and lost badly.
Badly or no?
Badly.
Yeah,
badly.
What was
Jeff, I'm sorry.
What was the proposition?
You had a good team. You should have been able to.
No, you should have been on the team. If you were on the opposite team, I would have lost worse, but it would have been fun.
What was the proposition?
Proposition was social media is good for democracy.
Well, okay. Well, this says undermines democracy, so we know which side.
Footnote, mighty enough in 2018.
Yeah.
Right.
So, but also, and in a more serious note, yesterday, of course, in some ways, this is ripped straight from the headlines because, of course, yesterday there was yet another shooting, sad to say, in a newsroom at a newspaper. And there is a Facebook connection to this because apparently the grudge that the fellow had against the newspaper goes back to his using Facebook to harass somebody, being prosecuted for that, and the newspaper reporting on it. So there, as you said, ripped from the headlines, Siva. This is there's plenty, and you start the book with plenty of examples of how Facebook has been problematic for years. But Jeff, I know you also have many examples of how Facebook does achieve in some respects.
And Siva does, because he is a fair man, he lists those things. I guess my first question for you, Siva, is that it seems I had to write a book chapter recently. I don't have the attention span to write the whole book, just a chapter. And I, as I was thinking it through, I realized that I think that our problem is with us. It's with human behavior on technology rather than the technology itself. Aren't you more disappointed in your fellow man and woman than you are with Facebook's dashed dreams?
So two things about that. One, I don't think it's an either-or situation. Technologies are extensions of ourselves, as McLuhan reminded us. Technologies are not distinct from societies, cultures, and practices. They represent embedded values of the designers. And when they're out in the world, they represent and amplify and alter and are altered by our behaviors, everyday behaviors, right? So that's important to remember. It's never an either-or thing between human beings and technologies. After all, Facebook is full of human beings, right? It's human beings wrote the code, human beings came up with the interface, human beings designed the whole system and outlined its purpose in the world, right? And sort of launched it and promoted it, right? So human hands touched every single part of it. Human minds inspired all of it. So that's one thing. But am I more disappointed in us than I am in Facebook? Well, that's a function of expectations or a question of expectations, right? I think after the last century that we've had, and certainly the last few years, I don't have high expectations for our species, right? I'm going to move this a little bit. I don't have high expectations for our species. I think that holding societies together so we don't all start beating each other up is a hard thing to do and requires constant vigilance, processes, norms, beliefs, morals, rules, laws, and institutions that we believe in. And for a variety of reasons that precede Facebook, we have seen the erosion a lot of those norms and institutions around the world. In fact, I think the United States so far has gotten off fairly easy. We're not in as bad a situation as the Philippines are.
But don't speak too soon.
Or is, right? So, or Turkey, right? No. It's like after this week, I'm just like, I can't even begin. But, so yes, absolutely. But so I'm not so disappointed in our species because I know what we can do to each other. And here's one of the lessons of my book is I don't think that Mark Zuckerberg really conceived of the variety of cruelties that human beings were capable of, and the ways in which that human beings would quickly glom on to this powerful communicative service toward those ends.
I love Siva. He is so smart. We'll get him back, I'm sure, in 2019 because he's writing books all the time. Megan Morrone had a great interview with Virginia Eubanks. Turns out the surveillance state is already here. It's just not widely distributed.
So two things that stood out for me with this book. One is how you really root it in history. So comparing the poorhouse of the 1800s to what we do today, to what our government does today, sort of storehousing the information of the poor, and also just the fact that you spoke to the people. You didn't just speak to the people making these tools, which you did, or the people using these tools. You spoke to the people that were most greatly affected by these tools. And I just want to start with a story that you mentioned. You have many reasons for writing, many inspirations for writing this book, but one of them happened a while ago, like not very currently. You've been working on this a long time. You spoke to a woman who was using one of the EBT cards that were supposed to replace food stamps in many places, and kind of I had always thought, well, that must be nice. It removes the stigma, and just tell a little bit about a story of what you learned from her during that conversation.
Yes. So the woman you're talking about was a young mom on public assistance who goes by a pseudonym in the book because I talked to her many years ago for academic research. And so her pseudonym in the book is Dorothy Allen. And I come from a background in the community technology center movement, as well as welfare rights and economic justice. And so I worked for a long time sort of co-creating technical resources with people, mostly who lived in either public housing or in low-income neighborhoods. In this case, it was a residential YWCA in my hometown of Troy, New York. And Dorothy had been involved in the creation of this tech lab, and we were just hanging out in the tech lab one day, sort of shooting the breeze about technology. And I asked her, much like you just said, I asked her, so what do you feel, how do you feel about your EBT card, your electronic benefits transfer card? Thinking sort of the same things, that perhaps it was easier, it was more convenient, it was less stigmatizing than actually pulling out paper food stamps. And she said, yeah, well, it's those things. But also my caseworker uses it to track all of my payments or all of my purchases and all of my movements. So she would go into her caseworker's office and her caseworker would say things like, why are you buying all your groceries at the corner store? If you go to the grocery store, it's much cheaper. And so she knew that her purchases were being sort of looked at by her caseworker. And I must have had this incredibly shocked, naive look on my face because she kind of pointed and laughed at me for a while. And then she got more serious and she was like, oh, Virginia, you all, meaning professional middle class folks, you all should pay attention to what's happening to us because they're coming for you next. And that was 2000. So that was 18 years ago. And so whenever I'm writing and whenever I'm doing this work on how technology and public services intersect, I really have Dorothy's voice in the back of my head. Both for two reasons. One is that she was remarkably generous, right? That was an incredibly generous thing to say, oh, well, this is already happening to us, but you should watch out. It might happen to you as well. But also, I think the big lesson there is that folks in poor and working class neighborhoods are already living in sort of the digital future, right? There's that old Gibson saw about the future's already here. It's just unevenly distributed. I actually agree with him, but I think I mean it in the opposite way that he meant it, which is in many sort of low income environments like poor and working class neighborhoods, communities of color, in undocumented migrants, communities of undocumented migrants, right? We're already seeing sort of the future of digital surveillance. And so it just really pays to have folks like Dorothy Allen be the people you start these stories with, because not only are they facing sort of the most direct impacts of these systems, but also they have the best information and they're the most invested in creating sort of smart solutions to the kinds of problems that these tools create.
It's almost like what you're saying is Gibson's, unevenly distributed. The dystopian future is more distributed to the poor at this point.
Exactly. And the most sophisticated tools go into. It's not just the poor, though. I really think it pays to look in poor working class communities. But any community that you could think of as having sort of a low rights environment, a place where it's not clear that people's basic rights will be respected, that there's not a lot of accountability. So that could be, like I said, communities of color. That could also be in war zones around the world, right? That's where you see these really sophisticated tools getting tested. And it makes a lot of sense to start there. I think our conversations about sort of technology, even about technology and social justice, can be maddeningly abstract. We talk about these tools like, the big concerns are the things that are going to happen sometime in the future, right? Is an automated driving car, if it's given the choice of hitting a box of puppies or a pedestrian, right? Like, which one will it choose? And not that that's not an important question. It actually really is. But it assumes that the harms of these tools are going to happen in the future, that they're not happening now. And for the folks I talked to for this book, these are not thought experiments. These are things that are happening in their lives right now. They're having real measurable harms, including killing people.
There have been other histories of Silicon Valley written. This is not really a history of Silicon Valley per se. This is more like... I don't know how to describe it. Tell me. It may help if people understand how you wrote this.
Let's talk about that. But name a history of Silicon Valley.
Oh, there's quite a few of them. Fire in the Valley.
1984, that came out, my friend.
Yeah,
1984.
Yeah. There's nothing modern, I guess.
There's nothing modern.
There's Dogfight. There's some more modern stuff. But it's not a history of the... It's not a continuous history.
There isn't a history.
No.
Dogfight is a great book.
But it's modern. It's what's going on with Amazon now, right?
Yeah, I mean, you can get like the Amazon story from Brad Stone,
right.
Dogfight from Vogelstein.
Right.
You can get the Facebook story, Levy's Google book,
right.
and you can line them all up,
right?
And you can read all of them,
right?
But if you just want to read one book and get kind of like the big picture of the 40, it's either Hackers, Levy's book.
Levy's book's brilliant, but that stops in like 1978 or something.
Yeah, it is half of it's at Harvard or MIT. And then, or you could do Fire in the Valley, which ends in 84.
Yeah.
And I've got the third edition. It's smaller than the second edition. Okay.
Less has happened.
Keeps taking stuff out. Okay. It's not the history.
But this is an oral history, and that's what I love about this.
It's a different kind of history. It's an oral history, which means it's not Adam Fisher's history.
Your voice is not in this at all.
I'm not in there.
Yeah.
It's 185,000 words, 500 pages. So let's say 10,000 sentences, right? We'll say, line them up in order. That's your book. But every one of those sentences, I had to get some billionaire to say for me because I wanted their voices.
Did you go in, though, knowing, okay, I want to tell this story, or did you just let them talk? And then what you talk about is scissors and paste.
True. Tape, yeah.
And you paste it together. So it's hard to describe this. If somebody picks up the book, they'll immediately see, though, when you're reading about Facebook, it's a bunch of different voices, one after the other, but they're not all in the same room, I presume. These were separate interviews.
So, yeah, it's exactly like making a documentary movie.
Right.
Each chapter is like a documentary movie.
Right.
So what would you do if you were making a documentary about Facebook or any other company, and I want try to capture the early days? You go round up all the people who were there. You ask all of them to tell you their story, okay, and then you cut it together.
Right.
So it's as if they're all at a bar.
That's what it felt like to me. A really great cocktail party.
Yeah.
Where if you got all the people who were involved in General Magic, let's say, and you got them all and you sat them down, they'd be going back and forth swapping these stories.
That's right.
But you interview them separately.
Yes.
Transcribed it, and then literally with scissors.
So look, I love computers. I love computers. I can't write without a computer. I'm a computer geek. But to do this, you've got to take. So there's about maybe 10 voices, a dozen voices in each chapter, because that's about the right number of people you want talking in your little documentary movie, right? And then then you got to look at them all at the same time to try to create an arc out of all these quotes. And there is not a screen big enough to have everything open at once. I literally resorted to printing them all out and having like across the living room like lines of paper all taped together so you could see the entire 10 feet of interview, and then there would be like 10 feet of interviews, and then I'd put on my kneecaps from the garage. Yeah, literally, for like when I'm working on the house, and like crawl around and be like, that quote should be first, and then that quote.
That's how, by the way, we used to do this.
And then cut them.
But the theory was you would never have to do that again.
Yeah, but I desperately.
But then what do you do with the cut together thing? You scan it?
No, then
you have to type it in.
Then I have it, right?
Yeah.
And so then I can actually cut and
paste.
paste.
Then you can do it.
Then I cut and paste.
Good, all right.
Okay. Yeah. But to get that first rough cut,
it works.
Yeah.
It really feels like. I mean, wouldn't it be awesome if you could sit down? So for me, the ones that resonate are the early chapters, because these are all people. This was me growing up.
Yeah.
Stephen Levy, Kevin Kelly, Fred Davis, Fabrice Florin. And then the Whole Earth Electronic Link, Larry Brilliant, Stuart Brand, Ram Dass? You interviewed Ram Dass?
Okay, so, some people you can't get to.
Yeah.
Steve Jobs would be a tough interview right now.
But there's lots, but he's got a lot of...
But there's archival stuff. You
Yeah.
can go to Stanford. You can go to the History Museum. You can go to reporters who interviewed these guys and say, hey, I'm doing this thing. Can I have your master tapes? And you can get sometimes quotes that have never been seen before. And sometimes they're just the classic quotes.
But then they're suddenly in context now because you've got the other people around it. And it's a really interesting way to write a book. The only other person I could think of is Studs Terkel.
Except Studs didn't cut them together.
Right.
Working, they're not cut together. Every chapter is a different person. And it's just
but it has
interview.
that feel of immediacy, and you're hearing the person talk in their words about what happened. And I really, that's what made Studs brilliant.
I love that book, Working, but
so it's like
we did it a little differently.
Yeah, it's like a cocktail party meets Working, or something. This is going to be a little trip back in time to what John Scully called the best company, most important company in Silicon Valley nobody's ever heard of. It's General Magic. Now, some of you have heard of it, but you're going to know a lot more about it after you meet our guests. Sarah Karush is here and Matt Maud. They're the directors of a brand new documentary just premiered at the Tribeca Film Festival called General Magic. It's the movie about this company that nobody ever heard of. Welcome. It's great to have you on Triangulation.
Thank you for having us.
You worked at Triangulation, Sarah. Not at General Magic.
She just got here. She just got here.
You haven't yet started working here. No, you worked at General Magic.
I did work at General Magic.
Was it your idea to do this movie?
It wasn't my idea. But it was a long time in coming. It was 20 years in coming, because I filmed at the company 20 years ago. And at the time, they were just kids and geeks, and they were certainly doing interesting things.
Yeah.
But it wasn't until years later that I realized the enormity of the talent and the amazing things that the people at General Magic had gone on to do. And, it was that combined with the tragic death of one of the magicians that made me think, oh, it's time to tell this story.
Yeah. So I guess when you mention General Magic, that's probably the first thing you say when you're trying to explain why you wanted to do this movie is, well, look who worked there.
Mm-hmm.
Who worked at General Magic?
Well, I think, when you think about, essentially, just to take a step back, the film essentially and the story tells the tale of this group of young magicians who were trying to build what essentially was the first smartphone.
Right.
And so...
And this is time frame about 1991.
Yeah, 1992, 93, 94, 95.
And I mean, the idea was first concepted in 1989.
Out of Apple.
Yes.
I mean, I guess the seed of this is planted by Andy Hertzfeld and Bill Atkinson, who are the creators of the Macintosh. And they were, and you talk about this in the movie, for 5 years looking for something as important to do.
As the Macintosh. And meanwhile, you have Mark Peratt at the Aspen Institute, who has this vision of the future, which is essentially the future that we live in today, with these small devices that we take everywhere, that we use for everything, and that keep us constantly connected. And that really was his vision. But out of General Magic, came two of the most influential, instrumental people in the development of the smartphone: Andy Rubin, Android; Tony Fadell, who was a co-inventor of iPod and then iPhone. But there were many others too, like John Giandrea, who's now head of AI at Apple, formerly of Google; Megan Smith, who went on to be the chief technology officer for Obama, the United States. There's just so many people.
Pierre
Omidyar, who started
Pierre
eBay.
Omidyar, who was a tech, like a customer support tech.
He was a developer.
And he
support,
said, we should, I love this part of the movie. We should, I have this idea we could do like an auction site, and everybody go, oh no, that's like a garage sale. Nobody would want to do that.
Why would you trust anybody on the internet?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not going to work.
And he had a desk where he'd have all these checks piling up, and Dee, who's in the movie, would go by and say, "Hey Pierre, what is all that stuff on your desk?" And he said, "Oh, it's these checks, this little thing I'm starting." And that went on to be eBay. So really, just extraordinary people came from there.
Why was it? What was it about General Magic that attracted these people?
I think they did see the future. I think Mark's vision was correct, and they tasted and saw the future, and it was one of the best tech teams ever in history. And despite the fact they failed spectacularly, there were so many developments that came out of there. Whether it's the touch screen or the software modem, the USB. I mean, so many of the things we take for granted actually were developed. Emojis. I mean, there's a scene in the movie where you see them actually starting. Susan Kerr, who was obviously designed all the graphics for the Mac and is really, I think, the most influential designer of our age. Not enough people know about Susan, but she was coming up with these beautiful little animated emojis. So much. It was just this incredibly creative, vibrant community with this astonishing talent at this particular moment in time. And then Amy said it's a supernova, and then this talent was spread throughout the valley and the world, and has changed life as we know it.
I think as well, if you're a young engineer and you have the ability to work with your heroes, because Andy Hertzfeld and Bill Atkinson and Susan Kerr and Joanna Hoffman working on the Macintosh, that means to be able to work with those caliber of people as a 20-something-year-old. That was the draw, that was the attraction. And then when it's coupled with this vision that was insanely ambitious, I think that's why so many engineers just kind of flocked to the company. But
Tony Fadell's story is amazing.
Yeah.
You talk about how he came from Michigan, he was from Detroit. Yeah. He was just a kid.
He was just a kid. I mean, literally a kid. And he and his big thing was Mac Week. So every week he'd get it and he'd look and he'd read, here's Joanna and Andy and Bill, and they're going to go off and do something, and could I work with them? And no one's shown the tenacity that he did. I mean, he literally...
he slept on the doorstep.
He literally slept on the doorstep, and then kept calling until basically he wore them down and they offered him a job.
Like a job interview by attrition.
And the first thing they do is they strip off his tie and they take off his jacket and say, we don't dress like that around here.
Yeah, it's a very sweet coming of age story, but it is a classic hero's journey. You have these young kids who come and they go on this quest and they meet lots of dragons and foes and challenges, and they're brought to their knees, and then out of that comes this amazing redemption and story of perseverance. And as I said, went on to just affect it. There isn't a person, at least in our vicinity, that hasn't been affected by their work.
So you're at this meeting, all the project managers are there, and Steve is at this point, is he wielding product?
Yeah.
Is Steve at this point wielding an axe?
Well, Steve had started wielding the axe since he got there. I mean, every day you would hear people fall off the roof. It'd be like, sploff, sploff, all day long.
Not literally,
He would work his way through, it was the cluster of buildings.
But it needed to be done.
Yeah. And the first time I met Steve, we got in a fight.
Well, this is the story I heard, was that he didn't think much of what you were up to.
No, it wasn't that he didn't think much of what
you needed to justify your existence.
Yeah, so Steve basically
what did he say to you?
Fired our vice president in front of us, and called all of product marketing into town hall, and our VP says goodbye, and then Steve starts raving on us, telling us that
You're
we didn't know
screwing
what you
the
don't know what you're
company up.
doing.
You're idiots.
It was easier when we were 100 times better than Windows, but now that we're not, you don't know what to do. And so I said to him, the first words I ever said to Steve were, "No, you're wrong." And he spins around, and he looks at me, and he goes, "And you are?"
This is in town hall.
In town hall.
In front of everybody else.
Yeah. And
you
he
stood up and said, "No, you're wrong" to Steve Jobs.
Yeah. My first words to Steve were, "No, you're wrong." And he spins around and looks at me and says, "And you are?" I said, "I'm Sal Segoyan. I'm the AppleScript product manager." "No, you're wrong. My technology is many times better than Windows." And he goes, "Well, that's not what, they've been telling me." And then we went at it. In front of everybody, I look over, and there's my boss, like Peter Lowe, looking at me commit employee seppuku in front of everybody.
Well, what's your choice, right? You either you convince him this is a great product, or you don't. You're not going to be working there anyway.
So what Steve was doing, it turns out, so we fought for a couple of minutes, and then he goes on to something else.
What's he saying, and what are you saying? Well, give me an example. Like, is he saying?
Well, he said, nobody's using this stuff, and I said that's absolutely wrong. I said all the companies are depending on this. We use this. All of our big customers, small customers use this, and he goes, "Well, that's not what I've heard." And I said, "Well, you guys are lying to you." And so we just went at it.
But that's what you. But you know what? I bet you I guarantee you. That's exactly what he wanted from you.
It was. What he was looking for, he was being like this on purpose to see who in the room
would push
back on him.
Yeah.
And, after that.
Did you know that, or did you see red? What was it that gave you permission to say, "Steve, you're wrong"?
Well, I figured it this way. Apple asked me to join. I might be a dog on my square yard of dirt, but, I know every piece of that square yard, and you're on my square yard of dirt, and I'm going to bite your leg off.
And I know what I'm talking about.
And I know what I'm talking about. And he was wrong.
And you need to hear this.
And you need to hear this. And so he went on to something else, and then he tested somebody else. And I figured out, he's testing to see who he has to work with, and everybody that fought him back stayed, and the rest of the people left, right? Basically is how it worked. And so after that, he liked me.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
I would too.
So, but
you want guys that are going to tell you the truth. You don't want some schmuck who's going to tell you what you want to hear.
Yeah. And Steve got automation very quickly.
Did he?
Oh, absolutely. Steve was an ally and an advocate of automation. He didn't necessarily understand all the different details about writing the code and everything, but he understood its importance and its role and why it was necessary for customers to have that option. And while he was there, we got resources that we needed consistently. He made sure that we had the resources we needed to advance the technology with each system release.
Yes. And it did. It got better and better.
It got better and better. And there was many times when, we would have he and I would have conversations about stuff. There was one time he had it in his mind about, there was some particular thing about AppleScript and languages that was triggering his mind. And he would keep coming back to me with emails and stuff. So one day I'm sitting in the lunchroom, I'm standing in line getting my pasta, spaghetti, right? And I'm standing there and I hear this voice at the back of my head. "So, what are we going to do about blah, blah, blah?" and I turn around and it's SJ, and he's like right in your face, fire with 20 questions. He goes, "So what are we going to do with it?" And I'm responding, right? Like, and I finally go, "Steve, my pasta's getting cold." And it was like he just noticed it for the first time that I was actually holding food. And he goes, "Oh, I'm sorry." But he was he was focused on it. He was passionate about it. I didn't always win the arguments. There were sometimes he took other people's, he would referee an argument between me and a guy over something about automation, and I didn't always win, but Steve always supported me and always supported the automation team. And that's why we were able to deliver Automator, and we were able to take AppleScript native code. We were able to deliver AppleScript Objective-C. Those kind of things were possible because from management, we had this buy-in.
Yeah.
And that was important. That was really crucial and very important.
You told me that there are two people whose belief in you made you who you are today? Your mom was one. Who's the other?
Steve Jobs. I don't know what Jeff Raskin said to him that got him to recruit me, but he believed in me.
Yeah.
And he really gave me a lot of rope and let me do good things at Apple. Without his unshakable faith in me, I couldn't have done nearly as much.
He was right.
Well, it worked out, but...
Did he have a knack, you think, for picking talent? Because you were not a programmer. You had been working in neuroscience, right?
Yeah, I was studying consciousness and the brain. I was up at University of Washington in Seattle, working with Doug Bowden in the Regional Primate Research Center.
Oh, interesting.
And so we were doing experiments that involved cannulas going into the pleasure rewards areas of brains and being able to see how those responses were affected by minute amounts of neurotransmitter agonists in there. And I was using computers to control the lab experiments and also to reconstruct some of the data about the results. Kind of, you had to take the results from one monkey and map them onto a standardized atlas. You had to sort of morph the data. And I was working away on that, and I got a call from Jeff Raskin that I knew from my undergraduate down at UC San Diego.
He was a computer scientist?
No, he was a visual art. He was in the visual art department.
Isn't that interesting?
And in fact, his attitude toward computers is what put me in good stead when I came to do user interface design. He didn't respect computers.
Yeah.
Here's an example. The computer center had this Burroughs 5500 big behemoth computer, and everybody had to type cards with a key punch and submit these decks of 80-column cards with rubber bands around them, submit them, and then we come back the next day and find there's one damn semicolon in it. You know, you have to do it all over again. And Jeff took his budget that he was supposed to spend on computer time and bought a mini computer and some bean bags and some video display terminals and set up BASIC such that you could interactively type in a little program and try it, which is a much better environment for learning programming than submitting a deck. I mean, you could write a little program and try it now.
Right.
And the computer science department did not like him at all because he didn't. They were counting on.
How dare he?
They were counting on his budget.
Right.
Right.
But he was
provided
doing visual
a better
arts. So you were doing art with computers, or?
Oh, he was sort of a renegade. He didn't just do what he was pigeonholed to do. So Jeff and I became friends, and for a while I lived at his place in Solana Beach. So later when I got this, come check out this cool company that's starting up in Apple, in Silicon Valley, I said, no, I need to finish my PhD.
You were in the middle of doing your doctoral
If you don't
work.
finish your PhD, it's kind of like a driver's license. You don't get to drive a car if you don't have a driver's license. You want to do research, you have to have that enabling credential.
Right.
And he didn't take no for an answer. He sent me a round-trip airfare with a little note saying, no strings attached, just visit for a weekend. And my dad lived in Los Gatos, not too far from Apple, so I figured, okay, I'll come down for a weekend.
Apple's pretty small at this time, about 30 employees.
Yeah. And Steve Jobs, I don't know what Jeff said to him, but Steve dedicated one entire day to recruiting me. He took me around to everybody that worked at Apple. There were 30 people. They seemed like they were having fun. They were working on interesting things. And their heart was in the right place. They wanted to do something good in the world. But that wasn't enough. I had to finish. Consciousness is pretty amazing frontier, and I wanted to work on that. But toward the end of the day, Steve took me aside, and he said, when you read about some hot new technology, that really was created 2 years prior. There's a lag between the time when something's created and the time when it's available to the public. And if you want to affect the world, you have to get ahead of that lag. And come to Apple, where we're inventing the future. You can help to invent the future and affect millions of people's lives. And then, just as I was leaving, he gave me this visual. He said, think how fun it is to surf on the front edge of a wave, and how not fun to dog paddle on the tail end of the same wave. And I kind of stuck in my craw, and
He was a good salesman, man. I tell you.
2 weeks later, I had quit my neuroscience program.
Wow.
Never finished my degree.
Wow.
I had moved from up in Seattle down to Silicon Valley, which when I left was Santa Clara Valley.
Right. It was prune trees everywhere.
Right.
Yeah.
And I was working at Apple 2 weeks after
That's a brave thing. How did you justify that in your head?
Well,
I mean, you're throwing away years of work.
Yeah, my dad was really upset because he had co-sponsored 10 years of college education that was getting thrown away. He was livid, but
did you say, well, I could go back to this next year, or?
No. No. I just said I have to do it, you know.
Wow.
I know it's the right thing to do. I don't know exactly why, but I know it's the right thing to do.
That's brave. You're in your 20s, right?
Yeah, I was, this was 40 years ago. I'm 66. I was 26 when I came to Apple.
That's a brave thing. There must have been really something there that captured your imagination.
Well, Steve was a pretty good salesman. and it worked out. Because once I was there, Steve and I became good friends. We did a lot of things together. We'd go to long walks at Castle Rock State Park, and we'd have lots of wide-ranging discussions about not just computers and stuff, but about life. And
he was kind of a deep philosopher, right? I mean, he had been to India. He was really aware of the different levels of consciousness and things like that.
Oh,
yes?
Yeah, he was.
So you got along on that level as well.
Yeah. We often had arguments, but that was great because he liked having somebody that would stand up to him that wouldn't just kowtow, you know.
Even then, people would say.
I've been reading Ken Kochenda's latest book, Creative Selection.
Yeah.
And which is really describing what it was like working at Apple after Steve came back.
Right. In the
boy,
iPhone
it's
era.
so different than in the beginning where Steve wasn't venerated so much. There was a lot of back and forth. And what I found is that Steve challenged me and provoked my best work. Sometimes I would think I had the best way to do something, and he'd end up getting me to find a better way to do it yet.
Man, I love Bill Atkinson. Bill, if you're watching, we love you. Happy holidays, happy New Year, and keep on doing the great stuff you're doing. And of course, as always, whenever we have Bill Atkinson on, I just have to get down on my knees and say, we're not worthy, we're not worthy. Thank you for the Macintosh, for HyperCard, for PhotoCard, for all the things you have given us. Now coming up next, we've got an interview Megan did. Actually, we referred to it in the Bill Atkinson interview with one of the designers at Apple who was very much responsible for the look and feel of the iPhone, particularly Safari on the iPhone. Ken Koshenda, watch.
So you write a lot about the demo culture, which is so. I mean, we don't know a lot about this. You're not at Apple anymore, so you're allowed to talk about it. But I mean, what is it like? I mean, you demoed for Steve,
sure.
And tell us a little bit about that experience.
Well, to like ask the question, it's like, what is the design culture at Apple? It's like you turn over so many of these, Apple products, it says designed by Apple in California. It's like, well, what does that mean? Right? And I think that the demo culture is the most concise definition that begins to explain what it is. How do we design things at Apple in California? Well, we have this demo culture, and it's certainly something that we used to design the software for the first iPhone and many of the products that I worked on, here at the table, iPad and so forth. And what that is that you make a demo. The demo represents the stage of the product that you're at. It is the best estimation of the product, the final product that you can make, given where you are in the stage of the project. Early stage demos, sometimes they're just screenshots that are animated together with touch. Again, we were trying to figure out so much with the touchscreen operating system. When an app goes side to side and then you hit the back button, well, how fast should that animation be? we made a demo. We made a back button, and we tested out different animation speeds. Should it be 350 milliseconds? How about 300? Would that be better? I don't know. So we made a demo. And so we again and again and again and again, we created these prototypes that were as much like the final experience as we could. And that's how we went from an idea to a final product.
So you talk about the 7 elements of success, to success at Apple.
Yeah.
Inspiration, collaboration, craft, diligence, decisiveness, taste, and empathy.
Empathy. Yeah.
I thought that I really thought that was a great list. Just, not necessarily for getting a job at Apple or thinking you want to get it, but just for, what people might think of in their career, like how do they want to do their work, whatever it is, engineering, or talk a little bit about those 7 elements.
Yeah. Well, see, this is, after I left Apple and decided to write this book, I wanted to think back and say more about, what was the development culture like? I mean, these 7 elements is one of the things that I came up with. I tried to think about what did we do every day? If I wanted to distill down, it's like, well, like lots of other places, we had lots of demos. We had meetings. We went to lunch and we talked about the work, right? I spent long hours sitting in my office, staring at a screen, writing code, and so to go down to a level deeper than that, to try to figure out, well, what's in common with all of those things, and so if I wanted to think about, well, a good demo, well, what were the elements that went into making that good demo? Maybe when we really decided finally on what the proper animation speed for that back button was, well, what went into that? Well, taste went into it. I think craft went into it. The animation is just not a linear animation. There's an ease in and ease out. There's some craft and taste associated with that. But yeah, there's also empathy, which, I define as, trying to, put yourself in other people's perspective, right? And then creating the work that fits people and adapts to their needs. Right, and becomes intuitive for them, so that the work explains itself. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so trying to, as a product designer, trying to think about, other people's experiences is a huge part of what went into these products.
So we got some questions from Twitter. You asked on Twitter for questions. I asked for questions on Twitter. One person asked you, how did the designers collaborate with one another? Did they use Photoshop? How did you guys collaborate?
Yeah, demos is really the best way to explain that. But just to really speak to that a little bit more specifically, the designers. Okay, so there were really 2 development teams that made the software, say for the original iPhone, the original iPad. There's a software engineering team and a team of human interface designers, HI designers as we called it. And their job was, their job was empathy more than anything else, right? Human interface, right? It's right in the name. And so, they would do work in Photoshop. Sometimes they would send me a Photoshop document or even just a small Photoshop file for a button. And very, very quickly, then it was my job to take that and put that into a demo so that we could get it on a screen, right, and start tapping it, right, and start seeing how it moves on the screen, how it looks with if it's a button, how it looks with, how it families. It's just like one of the things that we said all the time. How does that button family with all of the other user interface elements? If we change the shade of blue by 2%, how does that work? So yeah, we did use Photoshop, but it was never really like flats of whole screens. I would get that and then very, very quickly chop that up and get a demo on a device so we could see how it looked as you were holding it in your hand and moving.
So obviously in this new phase of VR that we're in right now, one of the early, if not kind of like the reason that this phase seems to exist right now is Palmer Luckey. Palmer Luckey, you spend a lot of the book. I'd say the majority of the book focuses in many ways on Palmer Luckey, but that's because you had pretty good access to Palmer Luckey in your work with Forbes, right?
Yeah, I did one of the first cover stories on Palmer for the magazine a little bit after they did their big Kickstarter where the Rifts first started getting attention. And I focus a lot on them just because obviously they are one of the most important companies in this space right now. They're the one that Facebook bought for $2 billion. They're at the center of all this, but also because Palmer is just such an interesting character. And I think ties in a lot of ways to the guys who brought us earlier technologies. I don't know if people know much about like the invention of television, but there was a young kid named Philo Farnsworth who invented this thing and soon afterwards got the technology sort of taken away from him by a rich dude who ran a media company, and then Philo sort of disappeared into obscurity. And I'm definitely seeing some increasing correlation between the Palmer Luckey story and what some of these previous entrepreneurs are doing. But Oculus, if as much as Valve and some of these other companies involved right now, is they're the ones really pushing this technology forward. And the Rift, I think, was super important because it was the first headset of this new generation. For a lot of people, it was the first time they tried a VR headset and was like, whoa, are you kidding me? Like, this actually works. You have VR that works. And they really broke ground in a lot of ways.
And even before people had the ability to try this, one thing I definitely gained from this book was a better understanding, a better perspective of Palmer Luckey as an individual and as a technologist and just driver of this technology. You really get a sense from the book how genuine his interest has been along the way, not in necessarily enriching himself, because for much of the time that seemed to be a very low priority for him. It was all about taking his obsession with VR from his childhood and figuring out some way to make it a reality. You talk about kind of his involvement with the forums and in the forum community, and he's working on prototypes not because he's looking to market it or turn it into a company. He's just doing it because like he's having fun with it, and he's pulling in all the information and help from these other people around the world who are all participating on a forum and just want to see him succeed. It was an interesting kind of window into how Oculus was born.
Yeah, Oculus is really interesting because Palmer is a very 21st century entrepreneur. He did not get involved in this because he was like, this is my way. This is the way I'm going to be a billionaire. No, he was obsessed with the Matrix and Neuromancer and video games, super into like the Final Fantasy series. He was a geek, and he had seen VR in all of these different fictional things, and then got to try it somewhere and was like, this sucks. This isn't anything like in the books. He was an engineer. He was a really talented teenager. So he was like, you know what? I'm going to see if I can make something better. And he created a forum where he shared this information with other enthusiasts. And it was for them all about like, well, why don't we make this thing that we all want to play with? And in fact, some of the early forum posts when he started putting together the Oculus Rift, he was saying to people, here's what I'm working on, here's the project. I might raise a little money to help get the hardware out, but I'm thinking I'm just going to give away the design and the hardware when it comes out. And it's funny to go through some of those forum posts because people are literally posting on there, Palmer, listen, you should sell this. Like, this should be a company. Don't just give this away. You've got something really powerful here. And so, yeah, the company was really born out of that hobbyist and hacker ethos of like, we're building this because it's something we want for ourselves. And then it becomes an even more interesting story because then, modern international mass business comes in and changes the story stuff and how like these hackers adapt and how they fit in with the corporate world. And that's still evolving. But just the way it got started, yeah, it's fascinating. It's a different kind of entrepreneurship story than we've seen a lot in history.
Yeah, and it was really interesting to me that he was able to do this at such a young age. Like, he was able to be successful creating something from the ground up, and that has such a storied history as far as what people expect. He was able to do that, and seemingly, I realized there was a lot of work that went into it, but seemingly with little like effort, like true like I've got to figure this out. It really kind of seemed kind of fluid, and like it was just born out of passion and like, I'm having fun with it. At some point, it became obvious that it should become something larger. They started the Kickstarter, and then John Carmack came into the scene, and that was obviously a big game-changing moment.
Yeah, that was huge. I mean, once the Rift was a thing and Palmer was like, okay, we should start a company and we should try to get this out there, the involvement of people like John Carmack was so huge. Carmack was actually on the forum that Palmer had created, one of these internet forums talking about VR. Carmack was just one of the guys on there. And when he saw Palmer talking about his headset and what he created, he messaged Palmer and said, hey, do you mind if I check that out? And like when the dude who wrote id, who wrote all of id Software, who wrote Doom, when the guy who wrote Doom says, can I play with your hardware? You're like, yeah, of course.
I think you say yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And Carmack saw it and loved it, and he took it to E3 and showed it off to other people in the video game industry. And that was that first moment of other people in the power to do something with it.
Right.
Saw the technology and we're just blown away, and we're like, okay, wow, great. What is this? Where can we invest? Where can we buy it? And then with the Kickstarter, guys like Gabe Newell from Valve had a video there as part of the Kickstarter page, and like that's why the Kickstarter blew up, not because Palmer was that famous or great. Like obviously he was an interesting character, but that Kickstarter got attention because it had John Carmack attached to it, because it had Gabe Newell attached to it. Like it was that star power and these really respected people in the industry saying, hey, this kid's got something. It really made it blew up.
We thank Nicole Lazzaro for being here. She's the founder of Zeo Design. Companies go to her when it ain't working, when they need help, when they want ideas.
When the game's not fun.
Ooh. No one wants to play a game that's not fun.
Yeah.
We've all played them.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's hard to make a game great.
It's hard. Yeah, making games is hard. Making fun is really hard.
Yeah. Making fun is hard work.
Yeah.
Actually, that's an interesting question. Do they look like they're having fun, these people making these games, or they feel like, oh, I'm in the salt mine?
Sometimes, yes. Well, it's hard fun at that point because, in a sense, like you can't push a button and save the princess, you can't push a button and win the Grand Prix.
Right.
You have to feel a little bit of, frustration first.
It's kind of like a game, isn't it?
Yeah.
And then when they get to the end and they make something great, their vision that they had for the game powered them through, and then they have something.
Right. Well, and it feels worthwhile, right? You want to climb that mountaintop, and then because you had to climb it, then that's what makes it.
Yeah, that's right. If you just push the button and the princess was saved, that's not a fun game.
That's not a fun game at all. Right?
So you and I'm going to frame this because it's more than just games. This is life in a way. This 4-leaf clover that you have, it's the 4 keys to fun, and by the way, thank you for the autograph on this. So talk about this. There's 4 kind of leaves on this clover. There's easy fun, hard fun, people fun, and serious fun. Does a game have to have all of this to be really good?
Basically, what we found in measuring emotion on people's faces is that people's favorite game experiences had at least 3 of the 4. And what they would do is within any play session, they would actually rotate between them.
So it's almost like you driving around a clover leaf. You're going...
And then if you think about what narrative is with a classic 3-act structure, right? Beginning, middle, and end. This is a way that games actually vary the emotional state of the player, allow them to vary the emotional state of themselves, just by moving between different types, different leaves on that clover.
So games often start with this part, curiosity, easy fun, right?
If you think about what games do, is they basically offer novelty, they offer challenge, they offer friendship, and they offer meaning. So those are the basis of those four keys. Easy fun is curiosity. It's the hook that pulls you in, right? It's the exploration. It's the bubble wrap of game design, and it's all about exploration, role play, fantasy. And then But then after a while, it's like, it's
That's
like
too easy.
Dribbling a basketball, that's fun.
Yeah.
But then after a while,
I
it's like,
do it.
well, I want to
Yeah,
do
all day.
something more, right?
Yeah.
Something more. So then you have a goal. So basketball hoop, right? But a basketball hoop is, not, is not like, isn't like big right here in between us, right?
No, it's hard fun.
It's small and
Yeah.
it's overhead.
Yeah.
And the reason why it's overhead is that it's basically makes it harder, right? Challenging. So that's a hard fun. So you have a goal, an obstacle, the height and size, right? Backboard, strategy with the backboard, right? And then that, I got to, sink that shot.
So you actually talk about 3 stages here. First, frustration.
Yeah.
Like, it's hard. Like if you've ever tried to shoot a basketball the first time, frustrating. Yeah. How do they get it in there? Then the second step is something you call fiero. What is that?
Right. So basically, you want to. You basically are. You're trying to get that goal, and your frustration's building each time you fail.
Yeah.
But it's motivational because I really want to get it.
win.
I want to win.
The fire in your belly.
The fire in your belly. And so then when you finally do, after feeling so frustrated, you think about that. It's like, yeah.
I
so
did
it's
it.
like, yeah. So you get frustrated, and then you go, yes, I did it. And then you feel relief on the other side. So you think like difficulty on one axis and skill and time on the other. If it doesn't get harder over time, you're going to quit because you're bored.
But you don't want it to be too hard either.
Because you'll leave because you're too frustrated. So there's this zone. We built this on Csikszentmihalyi's model of flow, and within that zone, you want to be, you want that play, the perfect balance of difficulty and skill.
Right.
The only way you get to fiero though is where you're pushing that upper limit. And then you win at that point. Like just at the point when you're about ready to throw your iPhone through the window, if you win at that point, that's when the arms punch the sky.
So when he talks about flow, he's talking about mostly athletes getting in the zone. We know about the zone. But do you think video games create flow too?
They absolutely do. So yeah, there's and each type, each of the 4 keys has its own mechanics for types of flow.
Interesting.
So we've sort of done a tesseract to Csikszentmihalyi's model in a sense that these are 4 dimensions of play, 4 dimensions of what really makes games fun.
So we've got easy fun and hard fun, and I played games with both of those. What else happens here?
So, well, basically the feeling of fiero, it's a wonderful full body emotion, hard fun. Yes, I won.
Yes. When we do that functional MRI, there's going to be lots of red.
Lots of stuff going. Yeah, lots of stuff going on. And then though with people fun, what's interesting is that basically if you win in the context of friends, that's even more.
Oh,
fun, right. That's even more. So communication, cooperation, the social dynamic.
That's something game designers have recently discovered because most games until recently were single player.
Right. Exactly. And then once you get into console gaming, it was really helpful. It was more fun was had on the couch than actually in the game. You really were designing the experience on the couch, right?
That's right.
You're jostling your friends, or, calling out. There's more emotion in people fun than the other 3 combined. And people playing the same game in the same room have more emotion than people playing the same game in different rooms.
Because we're designed around people.
Yeah,
it's all about people.
But if you think about esports, it's got to be, kind of co-located or some way of a lot of social interaction in order to get the most out of a game experience, because then you get those feelings of first of all, laughter. That's the easy. If you hear laughter, you're getting some people fun, and then the feeling of friendship is super important, especially today when we're so disconnected with all of our devices.
Yeah. So this is amici, which is Italian for friends.
Yeah. So it's like the like button on Facebook. Why Facebook is so addictive, or even chat rooms. They're so addictive because you're chatting.
And then
with
amusement. That's the laughter, right? You call it amiero, which is the friendship that develops between them. And then finally, admiration.
Right. Yeah. So you might admire someone. You might feel nachas. If someone who helps.
We got a little Italian and a little Yiddish.
If someone you help succeeds, right? And then you can also cavil about their. So in Mario Kart you have 2, slots, and
Isn't
you
it
can
interesting?
have someone.
English doesn't really have the words for some of these things.
Yes, Italian has a lot.
Italian
and Yiddish.
It's the languages of passion.
That's right.
That have these words. I love that.
And I think that and then I think we can't move on without Schadenfreude.
Yes, the shameful joy taken in others' misfortune.
Misfortune, right? Yes, and I have some friends in Sweden that say "skuldglädje," which is
same thing.
Schadenfreude in Swedish is the only emotion, true emotion.
So you start in the book. I mean, I think anybody who knows the history of computing knows the names of the kind of the earliest women in computing. Ada Lovelace, who designed with Charles Babbage the inference engine, and Lord Byron's daughter, and go ahead.
Yes, no, I mean, one is legally mandated to begin a history of women.
Right.
With someone like Ada Lovelace. That would have been laughed out of,
But you do spend time, and I really love it, with Grace Hopper, which is fantastic. Amazing Grace is the name of the chapter.
Yeah, and Grace Hopper is one of these figures that's really often trotted out as kind of, foremother of women in computing and this important kind of sticker book character, and I think it's really, can sometimes be reductive to have these heroes, because Grace Hopper was actually a very complex character. She had a lot of issues. She struggled a lot. She was in a very strange and interesting and kind of a very dark period of history. I mean, she was doing computing that was being applied to, warmongering, essentially. I mean, she worked on the central calculation implosion, calculation for the atomic bomb. I mean, these are some of the darkest aspects of our history. And she also pushed really hard and was very tenacious during a very difficult period of the early computing industry. Just a fabulously interesting and complex character. And I think she's often reduced to the kind of like Grace Hopper on a T-shirt, right. Inspiring figure. And like all of these people, like all people, there's always so much more to the story, and there's so much more nuance. And I think, one of the things that I tried to resist in the book is, lionizing people as these kind of paper cutout sticker book characters, because it's great to have heroes, and it's important for, young women to see that women can succeed in this field, and the representation is very key, and there's obviously a lot of hunger for that representation. But I don't get anything out of a simplified hero. I want to have, I don't think that the alternative to great man history is great woman history. Right. I think it's more like this much more complex, messy human being history, where we get to see how people interplay with one another, their foibles, their passions, their dramas, their idiosyncrasies. All of that stuff makes it more interesting, and it's much more valuable and instructive to see how somebody overcame difficulty, or succeeded in spite of certain things. Because that's I can learn from that more easily than just some idealized heroine.
And as you tell it, Admiral Hopper is an interesting character, because she bridges two eras of computing. She starts in an era, the Hidden Figures era, where women were computers. They were human computational engines.
Yeah. I mean, the development of the modern computer comes from human calculation efforts during World War II. These women working in the basement of the war theater doing ballistics calculations, and then getting hired to, essentially manage or operate the earliest mechanical computers in this sort of secretarial, sort of telephone operator type capacity, not something that was considered to be privileged or required any real intellect. It's not until those women actually endeavored to translate math onto these machines that it became apparent that this was not an easy proposition, and in fact required a great deal of sophisticated, higher level systems thinking. And so Grace was really instrumental in that period. But then she took all of that thinking and that knowledge and that sort of, everything that she learned from that period of history, and then she brought it with her into the early commercial computing industry, and really advocated for what was then referred to as automatic programming, which was just this idea of moving beyond the machine level in order to code at a higher level of abstraction through, the use of compilers and generators and assemblers, and eventually programming languages. So she's more than just someone who patched cables during the war. I mean, she's really someone who advanced the art significantly.
You talk about a contemporary of hers in the 50s, after the war, John Backus, who at IBM, who said that programmers were a priesthood in the 50s, guarding skills and mysteries far too complex for ordinary mortals. And she rebelled against that. She said, no, humans should be able to write programs.
Yeah, I mean, back in those days, I mean, this is before programming languages. This is before you could interface with the machine in any kind of, symbols-oriented kind of way. This is writing programs at the binary level, at the machine level, really at the instruction set. So, the people that were able to do that in any kind of sophisticated way had limitless patience and had a certain sense of probably hard-earned, proprietary kind of mysticism over the whole thing, because they knew what a dark art it was. And it's not so much that I think Grace wanted to break out of the priesthood, but she wanted to welcome as many people into it as possible. And she knew the only way to do that was to simplify the process, which would also in turn simplify the process of, developing much more complex forms of software. So yes, she advocated for, she was seen as kind of a space cadet for advocating for automatic programming, but ultimately she was proven right.
She wrote COBOL.
Yeah.
Which today is kind
Grandmother
of
of
deprecated. In fact, even probably in your time, people laughed at COBOL programmers. But it was huge in the 50s. At the Department of Defense ran all its computers, as you say in here, with COBOL, insisted that suppliers provide hardware that supported it, dictating the direction of computing for a decade. COBOL, 10 years after its implementation, was the most widely used programming language in the industry. And by the turn of the millennium, this most recent millennium was the most 80% of all the code on the planet was written in COBOL. 70 billion lines of code. That's kind of mind-boggling. That's a huge success.
It is a huge success, and it's, I think it was a very well-timed intervention, because at that period, after the war, as the commercial computing industry was developing, there could have been, there kind of still was, but a major sort of Tower of Babel problem where everybody would be developing their own languages for their own specific hardware, and there would be no interoperability, and it would be very difficult for, software to keep up with hardware development, basically. So creating something that had, that was interoperable, that was approachable, that used something close to natural language. COBOL is a toughie, but still it was much better than, an elemental binary instruction set. That was really quite meaningful in terms of setting a kind of base layer for how we were going to move forward as a community into the sort of the future of computing.
Wow, when you put all of these segments together, you realize how many fascinating people we talk to. I think Triangulation is the most engaging show we do, and the one that really gets your mind involved. I hope you will join us. We generally record these shows. It varies, but generally on Friday afternoons, 3 p.m. Pacific, 6 p.m. Eastern time. It's actually late at night at UTC 2300. But if you can watch live, go to twit.tv/live, and it'll be Megan, Jason, or me, and maybe in years to come, we can get Father Robert come back in and do a couple of shows for us when he's in town. It is really a great chance to talk to some of the most interesting people in technology. So I hope you'll at least subscribe to Triangulation in your favorite podcast application. Meanwhile, I want to wish you and yours the happiest of holidays. I hope you're enjoying your holiday season. I thank you for taking us along with you. And a reminder, Triangulation will be back January 4th with a brand new episode, and new episodes all year long. So here's to you. Happy, peaceful 2019. We'll see you next year.